Ah, there he is, the Provost. We had dinner last night and we laughed a great deal, didn't we?
Lovely dinner. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Kotlikoff, Cornell's Provost, and I have the pleasure not of introducing John Cleese, who hardly needs my introduction to this audience, but of telling you a little bit about his long association with Cornell University. In 1999, Cornell first enticed John to come here as one of our A.D. White professors at large. Intellectuals from around the globe who make periodic visits to Cornell to enliven our intellectual and cultural life. At that time, many people, of course, were admirers of his work on TV, his writing and acting in Monty Python's Flying Circus, his writing and starring, both with Connie Booth, in Fawlty Towers, and in films like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Monty Python's Life of Brian, and A Fish Called Wanda, which he wrote and for which he received a nomination for an Academy Award. Since that time, John has been engaging, delighting, and stimulating Cornell students and faculty, as well as area fans. Discussing his films, as he did yesterday, conducting master classes for student actors, leading discussions of group dynamics with film majors, and lecturing about creativity, John has consistently fascinated Cornell audience with his eclectic talks and performances that have demonstrated, along with his ingenious comic talent, his keen intellectual explorations into multiple fields. A few examples. He has given a sermon at Sage Chapel, narrated Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf with the Cornell Chamber Orchestra, conducted a class on script writing, discussed religion in the Monty Python film Life of Brian, and lectured on psychology and human development. Of course, John Cleese all along has continued to create, perform, and entertain, playing the role of Headless Nick in Nearly Headless Nick in 2 of the Harry Potter movies, performing as the voice in numerous animated films, including Charlotte's Web and Winnie the Pooh, hosting a television special about football, aka soccer, and a BBC documentary about lemurs in Madagascar, and contributing to lemur conservation efforts, which led scientists to name a newly discovered species, Avahi cleesii, Cleese's woolly lemur. John's visits to our campus have been received with so much enthusiasm that Cornell took the unprecedented step of extending his 6-year appointment as professor at large for another 2 years. And then, even after that, we couldn't let him go and cooked up another title, Provost Visiting Professor. John's appearances have been so memorable that we wish to share them with a wider audience. To that end, Cornell University Press is collecting some of those campus presentations for a forthcoming book. Tonight's discussions will provide material for the book's final chapter, as the director of the University Press, Dean Smith, interviews Mr. Cleese using many of your questions. Please welcome Dean Smith in conversation with the incomparable John Cleese.
Thank you.
There's a dead bishop on the landing.
There's a dead bishop on the landing? Well, what's its diocese?
Haven't got a clue.
Well, it's tattooed on the back of his neck. We said that today at lunchtime. He suddenly surprised me with that line, which I hadn't remembered for 30 years, and we both fell about. And I thought it was a good starting point today, because sometimes very, very silly things have the ability to touch us deeply. Like a grasshopper hops into a bar, barman sees him hop, grasshopper jumps up onto the stool. Barman says, "Oh, we've got a drink named after you." And the grasshopper says, "What, Norman?" That's a sort of silly joke that you laugh at, and then you sort of laugh at it again for some reason. I love that. It's like in The Life of Brian. Do you remember when he starts saying you've all got to think as individuals, and they all say, "Yes, we all got to think." And he says, you are all individuals. They say, "Yes, we are all individuals." And then one man says, "I'm not." It doesn't mean anything, but it just makes you go on laughing, and I love that kind of thing. But you don't get that with more clever or cerebral jokes, you know. You just get it with silly ones like bishops with their diocese tattooed on the back of their neck. What are we going to talk about?
So the pantomime elephant in the room really is Monty Python.
Monty Python, yeah. It's funny how it's more loved here in the United States than it is anywhere, you know. If I go, for example, to Scandinavia, or Australia, or Britain, they're all on about Fawlty Towers. But here, Monty Python had some effect. You know what I mean? It touched people at a very deep level, and it's so many Americans have come up to me and said, "You got me through my exams at college." You know, Friday night, they used to sit down and have a good laugh and decide that life was worth living after all. And that's very touching, because there's no way we knew, you know? There's no way when you do something, when we were sitting in a room reading out things that we'd written in the previous week, and we started to laugh, it was the first sign that we thought maybe it was funny. You know, and when Michael Palin and I were standing in the wings just before we recorded the very first show, and it started with a sketch about a sheep that was trying to teach the other sheep to fly because they knew what their ultimate fate was. And I said to Michael just before Graham Chapman and Terry Jones started the sketch, I said, you know, Michael, this could be the first time in history where people have recorded an entire comedy show to complete silence. And Michael said I was having the same thought. So it felt that dangerous to us, you know?
Was there one of them when they laughed, you knew you had something?
Yeah, when that sketch went on, Michael and I listened to it, and we thought, are they going to think it's funny? Flying sheep, you know? And then there was a giggle, and then there was a bigger giggle, and then there was something approaching a laugh, and then there was a real laugh, and I remember thinking, I think we're going to be all right. That's how little you know about what's happening to what you do. And people will sometimes, certain lines will become, well, you'd say become viral these days, but certain lines become viral, and other lines that you love, no one ever notices or repeats, you know.
Like Pining for the Fjords.
Pining for the Fjords is where everybody remembers that. But the chocolate box sketch, you know, when he goes to the Wizzo chocolate factory, the health inspector, and asks about these disgusting chocolates, and eventually he picks a chocolate out of the box. He says, and what is this one? Spring Surprise. And the man said, well, he said, when you bite into the chocolate, 2 sharp springs spring out like that and lacerate your cheeks. And the health inspector says, where's the pleasure in that? I always thought it was a really funny line. Where's the pleasure in that? I want to say it to mountaineers, you know? I say, where is the pleasure in that? But no one else ever picked up on that line. Whereas the silly walks, which I never thought was particularly funny, I really didn't. It never really appealed to me. Isn't it funny? And then everyone wants that. At my age, at 78, they still say, will you do your silly walk?
I think it's the one where both legs fly up backwards. Is a good
Yeah,
one.
that's right. Well, I now have a totally artificial knee and 2 artificial hips. So I can do a geriatric version of it, but it hardly involves any movement. You know?
So, talk about why in America the Holy Grail is more popular than Life of Brian.
Yes, that's very strange, because in England, there's no question they like Life of Brian better, and here it's always been Holy Grail. There was a BBC poll about 2 weeks ago, which I was rather pleased to see. They literally, I think they asked an enormous number of good, well-established critics from a lot of good countries to list the favorite movies. Number 1 is still Some Like It Hot, which is really interesting. It's a great movie. Number 4 is Groundhog Day, which is one of my favorites, and I'm seeing the musical on Sunday, which I'm really looking forward to. But we had Life of Brian at number 6 and Holy Grail at number 15, which is not bad, you know. And then further down the list, because I'm a little dubious about these polls, you know. Further down the list is a fellow called Charlie Chaplin, you know.
So, today I read that The Holy Grail is one of the most authentically shot movies about the Arthurian legend.
Where did you read this?
Somewhere.
Really?
Yeah. Not peer-reviewed.
Well, it probably was, because Terry Jones knew a lot about medieval literature and quite a lot about medieval history, and we did get people who checked out a lot of things. But something like the coconuts, you see, what was so good about that, you know? What do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. You see, all that stuff with those coconuts was genius, and that was Michael Palin. Michael came and read that sketch out to us, and we thought it was wonderful. And we sort of said, well, what do you mean, the coconuts? You know, and he said, well, they've each got a page, and they do that, like that. And we said, well, how do they go along? And he says, well, they go along like this. We could never have thought of that if we had enough money for horses. So that was what really got the creative juices going. And once we wrote that sketch, we began to know what the whole film was about, because you won't believe this, but of the first draft, we threw out 90%. Because we had no idea what we were doing. We'd never done a movie before. We had, I realize in retrospect, no idea what we were doing. But we staggered towards something that had some very, very, very funny sketches in it, which became scenes a little bit as we found ways of linking them together. But it still doesn't really have a story or a plot. And I think Life of Brian's better because it does have quite a good story, you know?
Absolutely.
Which is why I prefer it.
So there's something also about Life of Brian where the biblical study was first rate, and that you were...
You won't believe this, but this is absolutely true. When we did the Python show at the O2, which is this huge arena, 16,000 people, and we did that 2 or 3 years ago, at the same time in one of the London University colleges, I forgot which it is, I think it was King's College, They had a weekend, a whole weekend of a proper academic conference about the effect that Life of Brian had had on the study of Christian theology. And there's a book out there. And they took it absolutely seriously. The extraordinary thing was they felt that some of the jokes there threw light on Christian teaching in a way that was original to them. I mean, it's astounding. But that's actually what happened. There's a book out there. And I went along and talked to them a couple of times about what we did. But they felt that we did things that highlighted certain things that were really important to discuss, which they hadn't discussed before. It's strange because people can very easily get caught in a particular sort of way of thinking. You know, when I talk about creativity, it's really trying to get out of the normal habits of thought. You see what I mean? And I remember saying to a very senior theological lecturer, I said, it seems to me that when you read the Beatitudes, you know, the blessed are ones, that it's all about trying to reduce the power of the ego, which was, to me, was so obvious. And he said, I'd never thought of that. Seriously. So sometimes, I suppose, in comedy, because we're not hampered by too much knowledge, we can come up with stuff that does make people think, you know.
So do you want to take a couple of audience questions
Yeah, sure.
on Monty Python?
Which one we want to do?
So this is an anonymous question. What was the most controversial Monty Python sketch you were part of?
Oh, I think the Undertaker sketch. Do you remember that? I do love that. I do love it. Was very, very naughty. And I remember it was the third series, and it was the last show of the third series, and Graham Chapman and I had been writing the show at that point, writing part of the show at that point for, I don't know, 4 years or something. And I said to Graham I said, the last show we're going to do for a bit, Gray. He said, yes. I said, and I'm bored. He said, so am I. And I said, what are we going to write about? He said, let's do something really naughty. So I said, like what? And Gray was a medical student. He was a qualified doctor by that point. He said, something about dead bodies. So I said, right. And I'll tell you the sketch because it's wonderfully outrageous. I come in and I say, I need your help because, well, quite simply, my mother's just died. And he says, oh, well, we deal with stiffs. And never gets laughed at. It's funny, but and he says, well, basically, there's three things we can do. We can bury her, we can burn her, or we can dump her. And I say, dump her? He said, what do you mean dump her? He said, well, dump her in the Thames. I said, dump her? He said, oh, what, did you like her? I said, yeah. Well, she said, oh, we won't dump her in the Thames. He said, well, there are two things. We can burn her or bury her. You see? He says, well, which do you recommend? He says, well, he said, I'm not sure, really. He says, if you burn her, we shove her in the frames, crackle, crackle, crackle. Which is a bit of a shock if she's not quite dead. But quick. Else we put her in the ground and little weevils, eat her up slowly over. Which again, he says, is not nice if she's not quite dead. And he says to me, where is your mother? And I say, oh, she's here in this sack. Pull the sack around. He looks inside and says, oh, she was quite young. So, yeah. He said, Fred, I think we've got an eater. I love that intake. What's she going to say now? And then he says, Fred, we got an eater. And I do a lot of, what do you, I said, you're not suggesting eating my mother. And he says, what, not raw, you know. It's wonderful. And some people think it's hilarious, and then I look in the audience and there are some people saying,
Yeah, I didn't know if you were going to go all the way with that one.
I can't even remember how it finished in the television. They allowed us to do it, which was great, on the condition that the studio audience invaded the set in protest. But when Eric and I do it on stage and we do the lines together, it's just wonderful how it makes people laugh. When it's talking about eating your dead mother, you can't get much naughtier than that. That was the naughtiest. Was that the question?
Yes. It was, this one is similar by Jeffrey Tokman or Talkman. What is your favorite Monty Python sketch to watch?
To watch? Oh, might surprise you. It's in the Holy Grail, and it's a scene with Michael and Eric and Graham Chapman, and there's the two guards there, and Michael is trying to tell, remember, people are nodding, I was trying to tell that these two guards, just keep my son in this room. And it's so wonderfully performed that I could watch it. And with Eric, we put it up every night, and I watch it every night, and it still makes me laugh that they just don't get it. And there's something terribly funny about stupidity. You know? Provided you're not on the receiving end of it. I mean, I'll tell you, sometimes when you're on the receiving end, it's quite funny. About 6 months ago, I was in Miami. I shouldn't be making Miami references, but it does happen to be in Miami. And I had a massage in the spa. And afterwards, I went up to my room and I got a phone call saying, Mr. Cleese, you left your slippers in the spa. Can we send them up? So I say, yes, of course, thank you very much. So 3 minutes later, I go to the door and they say, Mr. Cleese, here are your slippers. Give them to me in the bag. And I say, thank you very much. And he says, could I have some identification? So I said, well, you know my name, right? Because you just called me Mr. Cleese, and you know my room number. He said, but could I have some formal identification? So I remember that I had a copy of my autobiography with me. So I got my autobiography, and I went back to the door and held it. That's the name. You see, that's my name. You see, I'm John Cleese. That's the same person. And he looked at me. And he said, I'm afraid that's not good enough.
He's got one.
Isn't that wonderful? You know, there's something about stupidity.
How do we get there? Okay.
Was that the answer?
I don't know.
I was yap.
So why does it still play so well, Monty Python? Why does it still resonate?
I don't know. I wondered. I mean, really, we should ask the audience. Do you see what I mean? I did it. You're yawning already. Stand up. Come on. Stand up. I'm not going on till you stand up. She's yawning already, this one. Oh, dear. Where were we?
So, when we were talking yesterday a little bit about movies and today's comedy movies. They don't tend to stick with you as much, at least for me, and these do. They stand the test of time, and I think it has to do with the writing. So a line like "There's a dead bishop."
Yeah, but it also has to do with the audience. You see, when I say to people now, what was the last really classic comedy that you saw? there's usually a complete silence while they try and think of what was the last classy comedy. Do you see what I mean? Because Judd Apatow has cornered a particular kind, which I think is summed up in Hangover. But the problem with Hangover is it's funny, but well, the problem about it is it's about drugs, gambling, sex, alcohol, you know, celebrity, just very contemporary things. And that's a very limited palette with which to paint a comic picture. Do you see what I mean? And I always wanted to do a funny film about 1776 because there's so much about it that's funny, which all gets covered in the myths. You know, basically a third of the Americans were pro-British, a third of them were anti-British, and a third really didn't give a fuck. And that itself is quite funny. And the other thing that always made me laugh is that most of the British troops were actually German. They were from Brunswick and Hesse. And I thought if you started the movie with the British troops there saying, ja, das ist nicht so gut, vielleicht können wir etwas so schön, but then you cut to the American trenches and they say, goddamn British. And everyone said, John, they won't know enough about it. They don't know enough about it, you see. Now, this audience would, but this is very rare now because most movies, because young men go to the cinema and most people don't actually go to cinemas anymore, so they make movies for young men who go to cinema, and you finish up with Hangover because that's their main frame of reference. You see what I mean? Drugs and sex and alcohol and gambling. So it just means the whole thing becomes really not very interesting anymore. And when somebody does come up with a classic movie now, it's usually one I haven't heard of from Denmark, you know? And it's not to say there isn't funny stuff being done, and some of the stand-up is funny, but the thing it often boils down to economics, you know, and it boils down to the fact that more and more grown-ups were not going to the cinema, and that the audience was primarily for very young Americans, sort of, 15 to 22, something like that, and that the choice was normally made by the man, so we finish up with Hangover, you see. It's very sad, you know, I was in the Bond movies, which I loved being in. I really enjoyed it. I got on well with the producers. They used to let me fiddle with this dialogue in my own scenes. And it was a thoroughly good experience. I love working with Pierce Brosnan, who's a lovely man, totally professional, gets everything right, no fuss at all done in a nice, friendly, low-key spirit. And people often talk about, Bond movies. I did 4 days of filming spread over 4 years. Not a big contribution, you know, it didn't dominate my life. But what happened was that they started to discover that it was making huge amounts of money in the Far East. South Korea, you know, you mean the Philippines. And of course, the audiences that were going there didn't understand the nuances or the jokes about British society or the class system or anything like that. What they loved was the action sequences, you see. So slowly they realized there were these vast audiences going, you know, and the audience going in Britain that would get the little jokes was so tiny they just forgot about it, and it all became about action sequences. And I thought that that's wrong, because an action sequence should be kind of 3 minutes of really intense action when you really feel it. If they start lasting for 12 minutes, it's too long for an action sequence, you know? I have to go back to Bullet. You remember this, the older people, Bullet? You remember the moment when he clipped the seatbelt and the whole audience go like, whoa. So you lose everything because people are always going where the money is. And that really ultimately spoils most things, I think.
So what's happening in 2019 for Monty Python? There's a big celebration.
Oh, yes, the Victoria and Albert, which is one of our great museums, they're having they call it a retrospective, and there's all the stuff, you know, the costumes and all this kind of thing, and it's going to be there for 6 months, and then it's going to tour over places like Tokyo and Paris and Berlin, and so it's rather fun. I'm quite looking forward to that, because we're all much too old and doddery to perform anymore. It was very good, that show we did, the last one, you know, at the O2, and it taught me something which I'd never sort of realized before, which is I always thought it was jolly good to make people laugh. And it's nice to make people laugh. You enjoy it when you're making people laugh. It feels good. That's very simple, but I always thought of it as just entertainment. Right. And when I was in the O2, I used to sit there with Terry. We were doing two of those, oh yes, Jean-Paul Sartre, oh yes. We met him on holiday in Ibiza, yes, he was very nice. He was a bit grumpy, but Mrs. Sartre. We were playing one of those, and I had about 10 seconds when I was able to look out into the audience. The lights were on the audience, so I could see 16,000 people. And you know, they were all having a really good time. And I realized it wasn't an ordinary comedy show, because the audience on the whole knew the lines better than we did. You know, and that's very unusual. Even Shakespearean scholars don't go to Hamlet and know every single line of it. And so what was it? And I realized it wasn't a stage show, it was some kind of occasion. You know, we were making them laugh, but they knew the jokes, and they were still laughing at them. And I realized that there was something very good going on, because people were happy. And there's not as much of that around as there should be, as you might have noticed in recent years, particularly if you watch TV news. So it was lovely to see people just happy. And a few days later, I was, who's that famous singer who sings Sweet Caroline? What is it?
Neil Diamond?
Neil Diamond. I was on a TV show with him, and he started to sing Sweet Caroline, and all the audience stood up and so on. I had the same feeling that here's a whole lot of people together, and there's a good spirit in the room. Everybody's happy with everyone else, and they're all having a good time. And I suddenly thought, this is really important, that we can give people an experience of just being in a room with lots of other people having a good time. You see what I mean? Absolutely. Because there's so much less of that these days, with everyone focused on their wretched little computer.
Question from the hat. Mm-hmm. Stephanie Haslop, describe the worst first date you've ever been on.
I can't really, they were all pretty terrible. Well, they were. I was so hopeless, as we used to say, with women. Is that a sexist thing to say?
No.
You have to be so careful these days. Yeah. I like your laugh. Come on, you have to laugh again. Come on, do a good laugh. Where were we?
I don't know. They were all hopeless.
Oh, they were all hopeless. Yeah, I was so hopeless with, I can't say girls, can I? Young women. I was so helpless with young women. And it was because I didn't know. You see, I had a very uneasy relationship with my mother, emotionally. It was not a good relationship. She was a very neurotic woman. Very neurotic. She's the only person I've ever met in my life who used to write her worries down so that she wouldn't forget anything. It was as though she had this vast spectrum of anxieties, and if only she spent enough time worrying about them all, she somehow managed to keep them at bay, the actual act of worrying. You see what I mean? kept the bad things away, and so if she forgot to worry about one of them, it would come and get her. I tell you, if you have a mother like that, as you grow up, it takes some time to get better. Which is why I've spent about a quarter of my life in psychiatrist's chairs and another quarter in dentist chairs, because I'm a war baby. I have the worst teeth in the world. I'm rambling, aren't I?
Well, no, but there was a line in your book about your father preferring to be on the front rather than being home.
Oh, that's right, yes. Well, she did have a pretty mean temper. I always say there was only one thing that my mother wanted, just one thing, but that was her own way. And if she didn't get it, there was trouble, you know? And yes, there were, you know, tantrums and a great deal of anger. And Dad, who'd fought in the First World War for 3.5 years, I think he sometimes yearned for the relative tranquility of the trenches in France.
There was another scene where you've come back and you've got a career on writing television, and they're trying to decide you want to take them to the movies, or you're going to...
Oh, yes, that's right. You suddenly realize, because old people even as old as myself, they become so nervous and worried about all the things that could happen, you know. And I would come down to Weston-super-Mare to spend 3 or 4 days with them, and it was hard work. And then some days I would get up and I'd say, how about going to the movies this afternoon? And this sort of anxiety, which, well, what Mother would say, well, are we going to go before tea or after tea? You know? And Dad would go and start looking at the weather after the It was rather... This is how I said, why don't we invade Poland? And in the end, I'd say, all right, let's not go to the movies, because it was causing so much fear and disruption, and what are we going to do? I remember I had a wonderful psychiatrist once. Not only was he Viennese and Jewish, but he knew Freud. He'd actually met Freud. And I was talking to him about problems I was having, and he said to me, John, tell me, did things happen easily in your family?
So, but then when you and your dad were playing cricket in the house, where was your mom?
Oh, Mum was, my memories are, I had a very nice relationship with Dad. I loved him very much, and he was very kind. In fact, the fact that I'm not psychologically scarred for life is entirely due to that dear man. But we used to, my Mum was somewhere in the background, because Mum was very, very good at everything to do with providing the meals and making sure. She was terribly good at that. Really great. It was just emotionally that she was lacking, because she was so full of anxiety, and people were always worried about what's going to happen next. You know, life was a series of hurdles. You know, God, we got breakfast this morning. How are we going to get? Life was a series of hurdles. So there was she had no energy over for anyone else. You see what I mean? Right. Which meant it was quite amusing, because she was not a stupid woman. I mean, she spoke impeccable English, didn't make grammatical mistakes. She wrote very good English. I mean, never spelling error. You know, she wasn't highly educated, but she was very literate. But she just couldn't manage things most of the time, because she had no information. She was only interested in what was about to affect her life in the next 10 minutes. So anything more than about 12 feet away from her wasn't of interest, you see. It was just anything that might come at her in the next 10 minutes. And the result was that she went through life without acquiring any information of the normal kind, so that when, for example, my ex-wife. Sorry about that. This ex-wife person produced a salad with very small quail's eggs in it. I don't know if you've ever eaten quail's eggs. They're tiny, tiny, little, completely pointless eggs. And she bought some and she put them in the salad. And my mother said, "Oh, what are these little eggs?" And I said, "Well, they're mole's eggs." And she said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, you see, Alice Faye goes up on Hampstead Heath on Sunday mornings because when the moon is very bright, the moles lay their eggs at the mouth of the burrow, you see, and she goes..." Really? I never knew that. And one time she said she'd heard somebody talking about Mary Queen of Scots, and she said, "Well, who? I've heard her name before. Who's Mary Queen of Scots?" I said, "Well, she was a Scottish caber thrower who got killed during the Blitz." But the fact that her focus of her attention was so much on her own life at this moment was, oh dear. And the extraordinary thing was she lived so long. She was born in 1899 and she lived to the year 2000.
Wow.
101. So her life, I say this in my stage show, I say her life spanned the entire 20th century. You know, she lived through the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the First World War, the Great Depression, the rise of Hitler and Stalin, the Second World War, the atomic bomb, the space age, the Cold War, the collapse of communism. She lived through it all without
Did she know
really noticing any of it.
So there are two ways we can go now.
All right. Which way do you fancy?
So this is the first time you've been back here in a while. What have you been up to?
Oh, yes. Everything was described just now. They asked me would I come, you know, and I said, "Well, what do you mean a visiting professor? What am I supposed to do?" And I can still remember someone said to me, "Well, you have to come up here twice a year and stir things up a bit." And I thought that was such a wonderful invitation. And then I had a great 7 years and then 2 more. And then I was hit with this ridiculous divorce. And I had to find $20 million, which is a lot. You know, you can't pay someone $20 million just by sitting around watching television. So the trouble was, I just worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And finally, I cleared it all off, and I'm fine now. So I got my head back above water, so I hope to come back regularly if the provost still needs a professor.
So what are you working on now? Are you writing another show?
I'm writing a show which, in many ways, it sort of began in Cornell when I met David Dunning. Now, David's a stunning social psychologist. That's how he describes himself. He has now gone to Michigan. But he's coming. He's here in the next couple of days. He's presenting a paper on Friday, I think.
Yes.
And I met him, and he was fascinated by, he'd always been fascinated by whether people were good at how good people were at knowing how good they were at doing things. In other words, self-assessment. And he carried out a series of tests with a young student called Kruger. And what he discovered was that in order to know how good you are at something requires almost exactly the same skills as it does to be good at that thing in the first place, you see, with a wonderful corollary, which explains so much of the world, which is that if you are absolutely no good at something, you lack exactly the skills and aptitudes that you need to know that you're no fucking good. And it explains a great deal, because what happens as you get older, and I promise you, I'm not exaggerating at all, is that you begin to realize, first of all, that almost nobody knows what they're talking about. Right? Gives us thought. Very few people. The extraordinary thing about being in Cornell is that there are a few people around who really do know about something. You see, and that's very rare. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to realize that as a result of this mental aberration we have, most people are no good at their jobs. I wrote 2 books for the psychiatrist, Robin Skinner. And he was a remarkable guy. He was a bomber pilot during the war. You know, there's not many psychiatrists who were bomber pilots during the war. You can't imagine Sigmund Freud sitting in the back of a bomber. And he was a remarkable man. He knew more about people. And meeting him changed my life in a way, which we'll talk about. You know, he moved me out of my sort of... I was a victim of a good British education, is the way I always put it. And he was quite marvelous. And I said to him on one occasion, I said, Robin, in your profession, how many people, what percentage of psychiatrists know what they're doing? And I remember he said to me, about 10%. And I was shocked. But from then on, whenever I met someone who I just instinctively knew was particularly good at their job, I would say, how many people in your profession really know what they're doing? I never got an estimate higher than 20. I asked the question many times. Sometimes it was as low as 5. But it was normally 10 to 15% was people's guess. So that means that 6 out of 7 people don't really know what they're doing. I mean, they've learned a process or a procedure, but if that doesn't work, then they're lost, like I am when my computer crashes. Do you see what I mean? So this is quite a starting point, is 6 out of 7 people don't know what they're doing. And it explains why the world doesn't work, you see. People sometimes say, well, why does the world work? The answer is no, it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It's hopeless. So I'm writing this show called Why There Is No Hope. And the nice thing is I started it year... Oh, he's got a camera. I thought you were leaving. Oh, that's all right if you've got a camera. What was I? Do you remember?
Why There Is No Hope.
Oh, Why There Is No Hope, yeah. When I start out, I say to the audience, you know, a lot of you come to hear me tell you why there is no hope, and you think I mean it humorously, but I don't. You see? And I then point out to them that there is absolutely no hope. There's always been no hope, but it's even worse now. Shall I tell you something interesting? I met a man, you will hardly believe this, in Sarajevo 4 weeks ago, who runs one of the biggest, if not the very biggest marketing company in America. He tells me he has profiles of somewhere between 185 and 190 million people. He has profiles. This person likes this, doesn't like that, likes that. And I was in the middle of a conversation with him, and we started talking about attention span. And he said, well, do you know in 1990, when they measured the average attention span, it was about, for most people, it was about 15 seconds. For young people, it was about 15 seconds. At the moment, recent measurements of it suggest it's now at about 6 seconds. Attention span is at 6 seconds. Now, I want you to guess what the attention span of a goldfish is. It's 9 seconds. How can there be any hope in a society where people have a less good attention span than the goldfish? And you can go on and on and on and on. I mean, I had a minor problem with a little bit of surgery in my leg. I was naughty and lazy about taking the stitches out, and I had to go and see a very good specialist at Cromwell Road Hospital. And when I saw him 4 weeks ago, and he said, it's fine, it's healed now, we started chatting about this, and he said, do you know that during the doctors' strike in New York a few years ago, the death rate went down? So I got on the computer. I hate computers. I got on the computer and looked. And there's some wonderful statistics there. I mean, there was a big analysis from a very respected academic medical journal of 5 different doctor strikes, and in no case did the death rate ever go up. In 3 out of 5 of the cases, it went down. When there is a conference of cardiologists, right? Cardiologists leave the hospital and go to the conference, so the death rates at the hospital drop. But the good news is that when they come back from the conference, the death rate recovers. Right? Then I was with my cardiologist a few weeks ago, and he said, we got it, well, when you're my age, you spend most of your time talking to doctors, really. Are you any good at doctoring?
No.
Because I've got well, I'll tell you
My wife's
later.
a nurse. She's right there.
Really? Where are you? You nurse? I've got a problem with my back. Can I talk to you? What was I talking about? Oh, yes. So I said to him, well, what is this about sugars and fats? He said, John, for 60 years, we cardiologists have got it wrong. It's not fats that cause heart trouble. It's sugars. And I said, well, wait a minute. For 60 years? And he said, yeah. He said, but there was a lot of research. And he said, oh, well, it's much easier to get research for projects that confirm the current paradigm. See what I mean? If you challenge the current paradigm, so nobody challenges because they don't get funds for doing that. You see, that's the sort of stuff you're up against, the paradox and the contradiction. So that's why I say there is absolutely no help. There's less help at the moment, of course, because naturally of President Trump, which is the most extraordinary thing that's happened in my lifetime. I couldn't believe that people had voted for him, and it reminded me when I was 18, I went to professional wrestling for the first time in the Colston Hall, Bristol, and these huge hulks came out, and they were wonderful athletes, wonderful, but terrible actors, just terrible, and the worst acting you've ever seen in your life. And yet the fascinating thing was that about 40% of the audience thought it was real. Now, if they can't see with their own eyes that it's phony, how could you explain to them that it's phony if they can't see it? That's how I felt about people voting for Trump. It's inexplicable. Although, he has given me one or two very, well, the Trump supporters have given me. My biggest laugh 2 years ago was when they asked a woman about that recording that was made when he talked to a young chap called Billy Bush. And just, you will excuse the bad language, but you remember what he said. He said, well, that if you were a celebrity, then women more or less expected you to grab their pussies. Do you remember he said that? Yeah. And a woman, a middle-aged woman who was a Trump supporter who was defending him, was asked about him making that remark. She said, well, he would never have said that if he'd known he was being recorded. It is hopeless. But the great thing about when you realize that it is completely hopeless, you start to relax, and then your aims become more reasonable, which is to do with, you see what I mean? You say, well, I'll tell you what, instead of changing society, I'll just be nice to a dozen people instead. Because that's achievable. Do you see what I mean?
So Cynthia M. asks, what is the secret to a happy life?
Ah, very good. Well, I think it is, quite seriously, it's about having modest aims. The most important thing in life, apart from finding the right person to be with, is to do something, a job that you find interesting. If you could do that. What about her?
That's Cynthia.
That's Cynthia. Hello, Cynthia. Why are you pointing Cynthia out to us? What?
It's her question.
Oh, it's your question, Cynthia. Oh, good. Well, the thing is, if you say, I think there's a wonderful statistic, which is something like 33% of the American population believe that they're going to be billionaires within the next 5 years. You've seen those, have you? They're going to be disappointed, aren't they? You know? So keep your aims, keep your targets very achievable, because all that big stuff about billionaires and money and power, they're a miserable lot. Somebody was telling me yesterday about a doorman at an extraordinarily expensive apartment block in New York, where a lot of the people there are billionaires. And the doorman, who sees them going in and out every day, just commented, they never seem to be happy. And people forget that in America in particular, there's a sort of feeling that if you're not rich and famous, you're sort of a failure. You've missed the boat. And this is the most pernicious attitude, because for centuries we had people who were quite content to be part of a community and to do a job well, you see what I mean? And to have good friends in the community, and then to bring up children. And that was considered a good life, and now it's not good enough. Well, that means that 99.9% of the population are going to be disappointed. It's very simple. So the first thing is keep your aims achievable. Make them modest. And the second thing is don't have children. Because you're laughing, but children cause most of the misery in the world. You have children, you worry yourself sick about them, they cost a fortune, and then they grow up like their mothers. So avoid children. Instead, have cats. Yes. I mean, because cats are fantastic. They're absolutely wonderful. They're affectionate when they feel like it, and they're just a pleasure to have around. My wife and I have 4 cats, 3 of them American, 3 of them are Maine Coons. One of them is bigger than she is. It's the biggest fucking cat I've ever seen. It's about this big. She's having a saddle made so that she can ride. And the nice thing about cats is that when they grow up, they don't blame you for everything.
So we today talked a little bit about Cornell students and how hard they work, and I was thinking,
Oh, yes.
kind of sum up what we were just discussing, a message for them that you had.
But are we going to take a break? How long have we been going?
We can.
Why don't we take a break for 5 minutes? Because some people may want to stretch and some people may want to go to the loo. We'll be back in 5 minutes and we'll talk about Cornell. Okay? You like that at the beginning? Yeah? Good. Take your time, folks. We're in no hurry. Well, Dean was mentioning something just before we left, which was the first observation I had when I started coming to Cornell. I remember being very impressed talking to students everywhere. They had a real pride in being at Cornell. It was lovely. They felt good about it. And when I said, well, give me some criticisms, I had to think for a bit. And they said, well, they work us too hard, of course. I said, really? Oh, yes. He said, yeah, they work us very hard. So when I got back and started chatting to some of the professors, I said, well, the students think that you work. Oh, the professor said, well, we do. And I thought this is a very odd. I said, well, if they think you're working too hard, and you think, aren't we coming towards some sort of plan here? And I said to them, well, I said to the professors, well, why is everybody working harder than maybe they need, maybe they should, maybe the harder than is really healthy? And I said, why? And one person said, well, maybe it's because we're not Harvard or Yale. Now, you see what I mean? You see what I mean? And this sums up to me one of the problems that we have in our society, which is that I don't think we know in America now how to live very well. There's such an emphasis on acquisition and money and fame and all this. I was in Sarajevo, you know, and this is not a very wealthy part of the world, and they were all having a marvelous time. And I was very struck by this, and I've heard this again and again. I was a doctor that I was with a couple of years ago. He went sailing during the year, and he went down the coast of South America, and then he would, tie up the yacht and go inland. And he said he'd never seen such poverty in his life, and everyone was happier than they were in America. So I think happiness is a jolly good aim. You see what I mean? And I think everyone thinks they want to be happy. It's just they don't know how to go about it, because the culture is sending them the wrong signals. I mean, there's something, I don't know, there's two things I would love to do on television. I would love to do a series of documentaries about what religion would be if the churches hadn't fucked it up. I think that would be fascinating. The other thing is I would love to do a series about why very rich people still want even more money. I think it's craziness. But the trouble is these very rich people own most of the newspapers and television. So this kind of stuff doesn't get talked about much, because it means challenging the belief systems of your employers. You see what I mean? But I think it's great that people should be happy. I think I have a revolutionary idea, which is people should do what they want. I know. I love this lady here going, oh! It's so simple, and yet people decide that having a bigger car, so, you know, there's a mindless competitiveness about that doesn't really help anyone. So we could explore that in different ways, but it does come back. Starts from my thought that if the Cornell students are working a bit too hard, can we do something about it? Because what's it all about? You see, I mean, it's difficult in a way for me because I grew up in the 50s in England, and it was still strangely and in some ways rather nicely old-fashioned. And the idea was not to become very rich. During the whole time I was at Cambridge, and that was between 1960 and 1963, during the whole time I was at Cambridge University, I only ever met one person who wanted to go into business. Money was not important. It didn't mean there wasn't competitiveness. Lots of people wanted to go to the BBC, and if they went to the BBC, it mattered whether their carpet went to the walls of the room or whether it stopped a few feet, because that explained where they were in the hierarchy. So those sort of silly competitive things didn't go away, but there was none of this obsession about money. You'll hardly believe this, but when I started work in 1966 with David Frost and his show, I was paying income tax at the rate of 83%. So you'd go in and work from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 10:30, the government would say, anything you earn for the rest of this day, Friday, is yours. You know? And people were okay with that. And if you talk about Scandinavia, you find the level of happiness is far, far higher than it is in America. And for all the people who go on and on about, you know, what a great American country, the people in Scandinavia know that they're going to be looked after health-wise. And so there isn't that burning anxiety of what happens if I get seriously sick. And that's a terrible thing to be carrying around with us, you know? And yet, people who've never been to any other country, you know, when you mention the word abroad to them, they don't know where that is. You know? These people will fight for the American way. And the Trump supporters, you know, they're angry that they don't have a better lifestyle, but resolutely determined not to consider socialism when it's capitalism that's delivering them the sort of society that they live in. Do you see what I mean? But go to Scandinavia, and the people there are happier. And it's a very inflammatory thing to say. I'm a bit of a firebrand in my old age to say that I think people ought to be happy. But we'll think about it. It's a bit revolutionary, isn't it?
So what course would you want to teach if you...
If I was here?
Yeah.
Oh, how interesting. What would I want to teach? Maybe I'd want to teach how to be happy. Well, you know, there never used to be... 20 years ago, there weren't any books about this. It was very strange. And then now there's lots of books about happiness and positive attitudes. It never used to be. I mean, the whole thing, which wrote these two books with Robin Skinner, the psychiatrist, well, the odd thing about psychiatry was that it was all based on the study of people who weren't very well. Do you see what I mean? And if you were writing a book about how to play better golf, you wouldn't consult the worst players in the world. You'd go to the good ones. And the extraordinary thing about Robin Skinner was that he was one of the few psychiatrists I've ever met who was seriously interested in what was good mental health and what were the characteristics of people who had good mental health. And there were a very small number of studies. There was a grant study done at Harvard over 40, 50, 60 years. And we got quite familiar with all that stuff. But you said, what would I teach? I think I'd try and teach something to do with psychology, because I don't think there's anything more interesting than the human mind. And this is stuff that affects our lives. You know, what I've actually been saying to you this evening, even the funny bits, what I like about that information is it actually gives us thoughts about how to live our lives. Whereas no matter how good the teaching is, if you're studying geology, that's not going to help you when you get home. You see what I mean?
So, related to that, talk about what was one of the happier times in your life.
Well, I'm happier now than I've ever been, and I don't say that in England because it makes people angry. Oh, if the papers find out you are happy and got a nice marriage, they can't wait to find out something to disprove it. But I finally, after many, many attempts, I have married someone who I just adore. She is insane, but I'm kind of used to that. And she's totally lovable in a way that I've never come across before, and in a way, she loves me in a way I've not been loved before. And it seems to have removed a kind of deep anxiety that I had in so much of my life, because that relationship's now more important, I think, than my work. I think it is. And that takes the pressure off my work. And then, as I've already told you, we have 4 cats. And so, and also my aims, I'm not interested. Somebody said, oh, if you work really hard on this part, you will earn an Oscar. Do you see what I mean? If an angel came down and said, if you take this part, you'll earn an Oscar. I would say, well, how hard do I have to work? Because I don't need an Oscar. Do you see what I mean? For most people, it's the high point of their life. It isn't. It's not what life is about. Life is very much, in my opinion, it's about really for quite simple pleasures. And right at the moment, I find an extraordinary pleasure in looking at trees. You just sit and look at them, and they're so beautiful. And we don't, the trouble is, we don't have the time to do these simple things that make us happy because our society works. Oh, excuse me a moment, I'm going to just answer my phone. You know? It's extraordinary.
We publish a lot of books on trees.
On trees?
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm all in favor of trees. I think trees should have a vote. Well, they're only about 3 IQ points lower than Trump supporters anyway. Woo! At this point in the show with Eric Idle, people are walking out.
So, Priya Sri Kumar asks, what are your top tips for seduction? Do you know, I'll be honest, I was so terrible and embarrassed and uptight and totally English, you know, with women, that they sort of liked me, but I was the least attractive sort of man you could come across. And I think it was because I didn't know, because of my relationship with my mother and going to a single-sex school. And when I went to Cambridge, I mean, there were 200 people studying law with me, and 3 of them were women, you know? And I just didn't know how to relate to women. And I think I thought, having been to the James Bond films, that there was a sort of button that if I pressed in myself, I'd suddenly become masterful or mysteriously male or something like that. And what I actually discovered is it's very simple. Just try to be yourself. And then it's very easy to see whether the woman likes you or not. Instead of spending a long time pretending to be someone else. And of course, eventually they find out who you really are, and you've wasted 8 months of your life. So I just think the more you can be yourself and not try too hard,
I mean, and the other thing, of course, is actually be interested in them. When I went to Australia for the first time, I remember I started to become successful with girls. And they couldn't get over the fact that I actually listened to what they said. You see, because this is not part of the Australian culture. And so just sitting and hearing what somebody said and being interested in it seemed to be a very powerful sort of aphrodisiac. A bit like Northern Ireland, you know, where they used to go to dances and the men would be at one end of the hall and the women would be at the other.
So we can move over to psychology.
All right.
And how well do we know ourselves?
Not at all. I think not at all. And I think the great problem is that we are basically run by our unconsciouses. And very few people are really interested in digging a bit deeper to find out. You know, I think most people aren't interested. I mean, I had two friends in school. They're both now professors in America, one in New Orleans and the other, Canada, one is at McMaster's in Canada. One's basically a neurologist, the other's a psychologist. They've both been very successful in their life. And I've stayed in touch with them all these years. And not one of them has ever meditated. I find that extraordinary. Not one of them, the psychologist, this professor of psychology, has never sat quietly and observed his own mind. So that's what I think we're up against. The people aren't terribly interested in themselves. An English doctor once said to me, no, an English psychiatrist said, John, most Englishmen know much better what's going on under the bonnet of a car than they do in their own minds, you know? And very few people, a lot of people, I mean, the fascinating thing about Trump is one of the extraordinary things he said about Trump is he's very, very uncomfortable if there is a moment of self-reflection. Gary Schwartz, the co-author of Art of the Deal, who spent more time with him than almost anyone else, has spent about 18 months with him, said whenever they were talking, he would only be comfortable talking for 6 or 7 minutes, and then he didn't want to talk about something else. And if he was asked any questions about his own internal processes, he just wasn't. And he once said to Gary Schwartz, he said, I don't want to find out about stuff like that because I might not like it, you know? And I think a lot of people feel that they don't really want to find out what's going on in themselves because we all have good sides and we all have bad sides. And Mother Teresa took up her work when she realized one day that she potentially had a Hitler living in her. You see what I mean? Because she saw that she had the capacity for evil, then she was able to do something about it. And for example, I can tell sometimes when I become envious, which is, I think, a particularly English trait. I become envious, but because I recognize it as envy and say, oh, I'm becoming envious, that gives me a control over the consequences of you see what I mean? If I didn't realize I was being envious, I'd think there was something wrong with the person that I was envious of. Do you see what I mean? I would start making negative remarks about them to pull them down. You see what I mean? But if you think, oh, I'm feeling envious, you think, oh, that's all right, I'm just feeling envy. It doesn't mean you have to do anything. You see, you're just aware of the emotion. So.
And the work that you did on yourself, did that become easier over time?
Yes, it did. And Robin Skinner said something. A lot of artistic people are worried that if they go into therapy and examining themselves, that they'll lose their creativity. And Robin Skinner said to me that he didn't feel that that was true at all, which I think helped me so that I was able to. And what I think now is that I'm more creative, but I'm less driven. Do you see what I mean? And a lot of people confuse the two. They think that somebody who's very, very productive is very creative. Well, that's not a lot of people are very, very, very productive, but not very creative, and that's because they're driven. And if you're driven, then you really ought to know what's driving you, you know? You really ought to try and work it out, because otherwise, what are you doing with your life? You're being driven, you know? It's kind of funny, but it's rather sweet. Lots of people running around thinking if they could only have a slightly bigger house, they'd really be happy, or just a newer car, or, you know what I mean, if they could get promotion.
So do you find it easier to get into that creative space now?
Well, I know how to do it now, because it is all about just creating a space. The space is exactly the right word there, Steve. If you want to be more creative, then what you have to do is you have to create a space, and that means you have to create boundaries of time and space. So you have to find a place where you can just be quiet. And if you top of the tree and you've got an office and a secretary, you say don't to the secretary, you say I don't want to talk to anything or anyone for an hour unless the building's on fire, please don't, you know. And if you're at the bottom of the tree, you may have to sit in the park. I had a friend at Cambridge who came from a poor working class family, and if he needed to be quiet in his house, he would go and sit in the loo and bolt the door and study in there, because he could create a place that. So you have to create boundaries to keep people from interrupting you, because interruptions are absolutely fatal to creativity, because you have to let your mind roll like this. You don't know where it's going to go, so you just sort of push off from the bank and toss the oar away, and you just see where you go. And the moment the outside world comes in and interrupts you, then you're not doing that anymore. The most important thing is you can't be creative unless you can play. And if you're going to play, then play has got to be separated from everyday life. You've got to put boundaries, and so it starts here and it ends there, time-wise. And I'm in a space where people aren't going to interrupt me. If you do that, then you start finding that you just get in touch more and more with little ideas that are floating around, that are only the beginning of ideas. But if the phone rings, you forget them immediately, you see. And then as you get calmer, it's just like meditating, you know, the mind's all over the place for a bit, and then, as the Buddhists say, it's like cloudy water, it slowly settles and becomes clearer. And then you can hear the little promptings, the little ideas. And if you, the interesting thing is, scientists have discovered, well, not discovered, it's the wrong word, they simply by the experience, they find out that they often have their most important ideas when they're in a slightly dreamy state, you see, not at all. Edison used to sit in a very comfortable leather armchair, and he used to have a little metal tray, and he used to have ball bearings in his hand. You know this? And he liked to be at that little twilight area between being asleep and awake. So he'd doze, and as he dozed, his hand would relax, and he would drop the ball bearings into the metal pan. Oh, wake up again, he'd just pick them up. And he did an enormous amount of his creative work like that. And the guy, what was his name? Somebody von Stradnitz, German, probably. He discovered the structure of the carbon ring. He was late at night, he was very tired, and he was looking into a fire. And he just started watching the flames in the fire, and he suddenly got the idea that they were snakes, and they were chasing their own tails. See what I mean? That's how he realized that the carbon molecule was a ring. So when these greatest of all scientists make these discoveries, when they're in this very dreamy state, it's completely the opposite of what we're taught about being decisive, you know? And the research in creativity shows that one of the characteristics of creative people is that they defer decisions much longer than most people do, because they can tolerate that vague feeling of irritation, uncertainty that you have if you haven't resolved something. You see, some people can't tolerate that. They've got to resolve it, so they take the decision before they need to take it. And then I had this company that made management training films, and the most important thing I ever learned is that if you have a decision to take, if you have to take a decision, the first question is, when does this decision have to be taken? Because that's a real world. It's got to be taken before this happens, or, you see what I mean? It's got to be taken before he comes back, or, that's a real world thing. When does it have to be taken? Then don't take it until that moment. Most people want to take it straight away to get rid of that feeling of uncertainty. But if you're going to be creative, you have to tolerate the uncertainty and then just take the decision when you have to or when you really feel you've got to. Because two things happen. First of all, you may get new information. And I find that a lot. A lot of people want decisions. I say, I'm not sure yet, I'm not sure yet. And then during the course of the week, it just becomes obvious. It's not a sort of hard, you just kind of think, well, it's kind of obvious that this is the best choice out of these five. And it comes to you so easily if you don't rush it. So find out when the decision has to be taken and try to defer it into them, because the other thing, of course, it gives your mind more time to come up with new ideas. And we're not taught that. I mean, you know, everything I'm saying to you, I think instinctively you know it's right? It's not, you don't think, oh, this is rubbish. You just think it's unusual, but it sort of feels right, because we're not taught this at school. I mean, who at school ever said to you what I'm saying to you now? You know, and it's a basic part of education, and yet nobody teaches it. It's quite crazy. Meanwhile, there we are memorizing the books of the Old Testament or learning how to do trigonometry, and simple things about how to make our lives more enjoyable get forgotten. Am I going on a bit?
Well, no.
No?
I have a question, though, from the audience.
We should probably tell him a joke. No. Why do the French have so many civil wars? So that they can win one. No.
From Dan Zimmerman, what's your favorite Fawlty Towers moment?
I'll tell you exactly. It's when Basil, do you know Fawlty Towers? When Basil runs down to the town to get the duck, and he gets the strawberry mousse by mistake. And my favorite moment is he brings it back in. The diners have been waiting for their duck for an hour, and he puts it down, and he lifts the top off, and he sees the strawberry mousse and does that. As though somehow he's buying time. And then he opens it up, and he looks into the strawberry mousse. In case there's a duck in there. That's my favorite.
So you travel the world visiting corporations and talking to executives. What are some of the things going on when you do that?
I'm always struck by what a decent bunch they are. And I'm always surprised, because I do think corporation man in America is there's a lot of people out there in the food industry and the pharmacy industry who are not interested really in helping people to lead healthier or more nutritious lives. They're very keen to hush up any research that's out there that shows that the thing they're selling is harmful to people, And that's wicked. But in my own experience working with these here, I've always been rather surprised at how altruistic they are. They really love to make it work, and they love to have an organization where people feel that they belong and that they can do good work and, just generally contribute something. So I don't know, because I do think corporation thinking is at the heart of so much that's not right with America. And I'm confused about it.
What are the traits of the most successful leaders that you've seen?
Well, this again, you see, this is all a question of what you believe, because there's so much bullshit out there. I don't know if any of you have read The Black Swan. Have you read The Black Swan? It's a marvelous book. It's not the movie, you know, that was about ballet or something. No, this is just a trader with the name of Taleb, T-A-L-E-B, Nicholas Hassim Taleb. And he talks about, you know, you take investment bankers, you know. This is a statistic from a book by Leonard Mlodinow, who's one of the smartest people around. He says that the average investment bank is earning about $3 million a year. Their main aim, as you know, is to do as well as the market average. Isn't that extraordinary? They just try to choose shares that will do as well as the market average. Doesn't seem very difficult, does it? But they get $3 million for that. Because people don't realize that the investment bankers make their money off the trading, off the percentage and commissions. That's where the money comes from, you see what I mean? They're not very good at actually making people money. And there's all these paradoxes out there that fascinate me. Then I'm going to spend the rest of the next year basically going through this material in order to produce more material for Why There Is No Hope.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about spirituality and religion and how has that evolved your spiritual journey over time?
Well, I was Church of England, which was once described as the Conservative Party at prayer. I was Church of England, which meant really that nothing interesting was ever discussed in religious classes. And I was confirmed when I was 15, and I waited for about 4 weeks to see if some golden haze would come down, carry me off, and well, not carry me off physically, you know, but to boost me spiritually. And nothing happened, and I just gave up and thought it was all complete rubbish. And then in the 30s, I started reading books by an Englishman who came to California called Alan Watts. And I started reading stuff about Eastern religion, which began to make more and more and more sense. And then I had a breakthrough. I read an article, a chapter by Aldous Huxley, in which he basically says this. He says there's 2 types of religion. There is the type, the more meditational type, where people are actually interested in seeing whether they can have some sort of experience of the divine. And these people do spiritual exercises, you know, if they're Sufis, they dance. Do you see what I mean? If they're Jewish, they are interested in the Kabbalah. If they're interested in Christianity, they're interested in esoteric Christianity. And these are the people who wonder if there is something out there that they can connect with, and they are prepared to spend a lot of time in doing exercises and finding out more about themselves and trying to connect with it. That's one type of religion. And then there's the other type of religion, which is basically crowd control. You see what I mean? That is the great headmaster in the sky. Here are the rules. If you stick to the rules, you'll go to heaven and you'll be able to eat all the ice cream you want without getting fat, you know? Which is kind of contemptible. But an awful lot of people like it because it promises a sort of certainty. But what is so funny is that people can take a religious teaching and turn it on its head. Pope Pius X in 1906 said, "Kindness is for fools." Now you kind of think, if he was Pope, surely at some point he would have read the Beatitudes. So what is he saying? The Beatitudes are absolute crap. All that stuff about the poor in spirit, you know, and the meek, and all that. Was he saying that's all crap? What it's all about is strict discipline, and kindness is for fools. I mean, how can you take Jesus' teaching and come up with kindness is for fools? You know, so then there's this, what is this form of Christianity where they say that if you get lots of money, it shows that you're praying enough or something? What do they call it? There's always been a feeling in America, among particularly the fundamentalists, that Christianity is really the sort of the cornerstone of capitalism, right? You know, that's what we're about. We're a really good Christian, capitalist, competitive society. What does a fucking leader have to say that can't get screwed up by people? And the answer is he can't. Somebody once said, an idea is not responsible for the people who hold it. So you have this absolutely extraordinary situation where the leader or the founder of the religion lays something down. And of course, he's able to really explain it to the people around him, and they're able to explain it to the next 4 or 5 generations who are really interested in the ideas. And then the people who start joining that church are asking about the dental plan. You see what I mean? And you have to be at a certain level of spiritual advancement before you can understand some of the ideas. I mean, when Christ said, turn the other cheek, do you see what I mean? It wasn't a trick. Do you see what I'm saying? But a certain cast of mind would think it's some kind of manipulation or trick, because he can't have meant it. You see what I mean? So you have to be at a certain level in order to understand the teaching. And most people don't get anything like that level. And that's why what I like about Buddhism is that they insist on the oral transmission, and the teachers teach, because they're really very remarkable people. I met the Dalai Lama a few times, and there's no question that he's operating on a different level from myself, in the same way I'm operating on a higher level than the average Daily Mail journalist.
You believe in an afterlife?
Yes, I do, but I don't know what it is. I was a member of a group that used to meet in California for a week every year, and I was there for 8 years. They were all academics, most of them psychologists or social psychologists. One was a very famous quantum physicist who did not think there was any contradiction between quantum physics and an afterlife. Henry Stapp, if anyone knows. And there were 1 or 2 anthropologists. We studied the stuff, and I came away from the 8 years thinking there is an afterlife, but I think the problem is trying to say what it's about, you know. People start trying to draw up these maps of what the afterlife. I don't think our minds probably aren't capable of taking it in. But I genuinely do think something goes on. Not perhaps for everyone. Maybe one has to do a sort of certain amount of work in order to gain an afterlife. I don't know. But what I like about it is it's helped me with my fear of death, which was never tremendously strong when I was young. But the idea, I really think now when I'm lying on my deathbed, probably 3/4 panicked, but there will be 1/4 of me thinking, ooh, I wonder what happens next. And I think that it helps the thought of dying if you think there's something else coming, you know. And I may be foolish, but you see, the trouble with science is they say that can't be possible because we don't have a theory to justify it. And that's the wrong way around. In science, the territory is primary to the map. You see what I mean? You look at the territory, and then you draw a map of the territory, and if you look at the map and look at the territory and compare them, and on the map there's a bridge, and on the real life there isn't a bridge, you see, you don't say, well, obviously there's a bridge. You see what I mean? You look at the reality and say, oh, there isn't a bridge. Why does the map say there is a bridge? So the territory is primary to the map. And scientists don't behave like that. Scientists are much more interested in the theory. They have a deep emotional attachment to the theory. And if anybody starts challenging the theory, they're never curious about it. They're just angry. you know, because they want to be right.
So we have time for one more question, and it's an anonymous question. Oh, no, hold on one second. Let me get the name. Jack Mindich.
Oh.
What is the worst article you've ever seen in the Daily Mail?
The one that annoyed me most is when I first started going out with my wife, who I call her Fish, because she swims like a fish. The first time I saw her swim up and down, 45 minutes she went up and down the pool, and then got out, and she wasn't even out of breath. And I thought, she knows how to breathe underwater. And she's the only human being I've ever met who knows how to breathe underwater, so I call her Fish. So anyway, I'd started to go out with Fish, and the Daily Mail ran one of its nasty pieces. You don't really take it personally, because it's a way of life, but this one got to me because they said about her that she used to dance naked in order to keep my interest in her up. You see, it was profoundly demeaning to her. It also raises the question as how would they know? I mean, unless she did it in Hyde Park, then you see what I mean? So you have to deal with this constant flow of malicious misinformation from the Daily Mail. And I'm engaged in a sort of a struggle with them, because they are so unscrupulous and so dishonest and just must never be trusted. You must never trust them, because they're quite clever, you know, quite plausible. And they chat to you until you think they're actually interested in you, and then they'll slip the question in, and that's the only thing they'll ever quote from the interview. And I'm very shocked by British journalism. On the way over on the plane on Saturday, I read the New York Times, and I read the Sunday Times and the Sunday Telegraph. And the gap in quality between the papers is absolutely breathtaking. And the New York Times, I think, is a wonderful paper, you know? And I read 3 articles in it, all of which were absolutely first class. The Sunday Times is just kind of dreary and heavy. There was one very, very good piece in it by a guy called Matt Lucas. And otherwise, it was just like anything that Murdoch touches, which is slightly grubby. And then there was the Sunday Telegraph, which is just hopeless. It's the dullest, most boring, useless waste of trees you ever saw in your life. Absolutely terrible. Owned by a reclusive pair of twins called the Barclay twins, who were simply interested in advertising revenue. And about 3 years ago, they decided that the way to boost their profits was to get rid of all the good writers, because they were more expensive. It's almost entirely run by ex-employees of the Daily Mail. So I despair for British journalism, but what I love about this country is there's great resilience here, you know? And there are centers of quality that are just as good as anything, and probably better than you have most of the rest of the world. And I'm absolutely delighted at the thought of being able to come back on a regular basis and bore you.
Thank you very much.
What do we do now? Thank you.